Hey guys, Peter here to do an album review. Today I'm here to tell you about the latest from Carcass, Arteries, out September 17th on Nuclear Blast. This album has 10 tracks, 53 minutes in length, and this is the band's 7th full-length studio album. This is their first album in 8 years. That's a very long time for this iconic extreme metal band from England. Now, how is this album put together? Well, the structure feels very modern. It doesn't have that linear style approach, that roadmap that forces the listener to follow a certain path in order for you to get the most out of this record. This album allows you to be on the driver's seat. You could come at it from different angles, different approaches. You could listen to it in different platforms. The playability and the quality of the album are really defined by the quality of the individual songs, not how they coexist with one another in the overall context of the record. Once you get into the soundscape, this is where things start to become a little bit more interesting. This is an album that has a very unique characteristic. You press play, you know you're listening to a Carcass album. You just feel it. This is a Carcass record through and through. But having said that, they didn't photocopy something that was done in the past. They didn't go back to reinvent the wheel or recreate history. What they did was they took certain elements, very few elements from previous records, and they sprinkled them throughout these 10 songs, allowing you to feel like that Carcass DNA is present on all 10 tracks and never really absent from the record. At the same time, they gave themselves enough room to be creative, to really push the sound of the band forward more into the future with a little bit more of a modern touch to it. Really interesting style, really interesting approach, keeping some of the sounds, some of the configurations that made Carcass Carcass, so that you feel connected with the record from the get-go because it sounds familiar to you, and at the same time introducing novelties, introducing new ideas, new sounds, new approaches to really move the band forward and not just create an album that you already heard before, and keep things fresh, keep things moving, keeping things exciting. Within that soundscape, within that movement towards more of a modern sound, towards more of a modern approach, the motor behind it has to be the guitars. When you listen to this record, it's a very guitar-driven album. The guitars sound very groovy, almost on every single track. There's at least one moment within a track that you feel that grooviness coming to the forefront. They also have a lot of melody. They're also very driven, but at the end of the day, regardless of what style you're getting from them, they're always very thick in their sound, and that is something that stays consistent across every single track. So regardless in which journey those guitars are taking you, regardless of what approach they're giving to you as a listener from song to song, the fact that they always have volume, the fact that they always have thickness to their approach, to their execution, really allows this album to stay balanced, really allows this album to stay cohesive while pulling you in different directions. And then you get the drums and bass. The drums and bass play a very important role. At first glance, you may feel like the guitars are taking the spotlight, they're dominating your attention, but the drums and bass really add consistency to that thickness of sound. The guitars can only be the way they are or feel as thick as they are because the bass and the drums are giving them this ramp, this launching ramp that allows the guitars to have a little bit more life, to have a little bit more mobility and be a little bit more dynamic at times. So I really love the drum and bass sound together. The combination of those two really adds an extra flavor, it adds an extra sound, it adds an extra tier, an extra layer, whatever you want to call it, to the overall experience, because like I said, this is a very thick sounding record, and it's thick from the guitar side of things, but the drums and bass are adding extra thickness to that volume to really make this a robust sounding album through and through. Once you get into the vocals, Jeff Walker is vintage. That's all I can really say. I mean, I don't feel like there's been anything missed. 8-year break between full-length records. He sounds exactly the same. He sounds phenomenal. It has that voice that's very unique to him, that the moment you hear it, you know you're listening to Jeff Walker, you know you're listening to Carcass, and he's also one of the elements on this record that really unifies the album, because the songs sometimes do change direction, they do change approach, they do go in different directions. And while there's some elements within the soundscape that have that Carcass DNA, nothing has that DNA more so than his voice. So he's a little bit of the glue that holds this whole record together. As far as the album goes, what is there to say? I feel like this is a record that's going to have a different impact on the listener depending on what your perception of what this album should be. Not what this album is, but what it should be. If you're coming into this record expecting them to recreate one of your favorite records from the past, or expecting them to kind of go back into their roots, considering it's been 8 years since they released a record, I feel like you're going to be disappointed, because that's not what this album is about. This album is more about looking towards the future than it is about remembering the past. There's still going to be some elements of the band's DNA there, the band's past there. It's impossible for them to completely wash those away, and you need them to be there in order for the album to have a sense of continuity. But this record is really the band looking forward, not necessarily living in the shadow of what's done behind them. So this is a record that's going to resonate with fans that have the ability to kind of reset their mind, reset the expectations, and travel with the band and go with the band on where they need to go moving forward, not necessarily wanting them to go back and recreate an album that they fell in love with when they were teenagers. Going into my favorite songs on this record, I have to start off with Torn Arteries. This is the opening track on the record. Great guitar thickness, and that hits you immediately. Becomes really the trademark of the whole record, but it hits you immediately as this song starts. Everything else complements that thickness, complements that sound. It comes at you with aggression at every single turn. A very driven song. The pauses that this track offers allow the rest of the track to feel even bigger, to feel even more aggressive, to feel like it's even more in your face. So it's a really interesting track in terms of offering a few breaks here and there, but those breaks just ignite everything else around them. It doesn't really feel like it's slowing down the song. The solo complements the track. It confirms the great guitar work that you're going to get throughout this album. There's incredible solos on this album. This song has a very interesting one that plays a break feel. It really ignites itself. It puts it on a platter for you to really pay attention to it. And from the get-go, when a song like this, in terms of how it's constructed, in terms of how it's delivered, really allows you to connect with the guitar sound all around, from a riff's perspective, from how driven it is, and then how melodic the solos can be. And you're going to see this dynamic approach throughout the whole entire album. So this is a very important opening track because it kind of sets the mood, it sets the table for how these songs are going to be constructed, for how they're going to come at you, and how the overall guitar's perspective is going to be throughout the record. Next you have Eleanor, Rigor, Mortis. I love this track because I love the title of this track. The moment I saw this, I started laughing. I thought of Eleanor Rigby. Nice little play on words, so I had to pick this as one of my favorite tracks. Turns out that the title of the track matches the quality of the track itself, so it's a perfect marriage, it's a perfect match. This is a more chunky, methodic song. It comes at you a little bit slower, but that allows you to appreciate the bass sound and the drums a little bit more. You're not as concentrated on the guitars. The guitars are giving you a little bit more of a thick sound, of a groovy, gritty sound that's coming through. So because that is a little bit more constant throughout the track and it's not necessarily in your face, your mind is able to go into the drums, into the bass, and see what those elements are doing and really appreciate the life that they're bringing to this song, the volume that they add. The solo brings a little bit of darkness to this track, adds to the darkness that you're already getting from the vocals. So it's a really interesting dynamic. It's layers that you're adding to the way the song comes across, and I really like how this song feels. It feels very contained. It doesn't feel explosive. It doesn't feel like it's breaking. It allows you to really break it apart and understand all the different elements throughout, because once again, it doesn't have that in-your-face, abrupt, aggressive sound all the way through it. Very contained. Last but not least, In God We Trust. I never thought I would see this title for a track on a Carcass record, but here we are. The drums and guitars really lay down the path in which this song travels on. The song lives off of the coexistence of those two elements, drums and guitars, how they work together, how the sound morphs between them, and what does that do for the overall experience. The vocals come in more to guide your experience because that experience is really defined by those two elements. There's a little bit of a darkness to this track. There's layers that really help define that darkness, that really help define those momentums. The solo section feels very different from everything that's happening on this song. Up until that point, there's this sense of darkness on all the different elements that are coming together. The solo is almost like you open up the windows to a very dark room and you let the sun in. It feels so out of place, but at the same time, it works so well to kind of change your eyesight, your perception of what this track is all about. Once that solo section finishes, the darkness comes back in, but not completely, because they keep the guitars there with some melodies, with some interesting dynamics that allow that light, that brightness that the solos brought into the forefront to still stay alive towards the end of the song, and you start to have a mixture of the darkness of what the drums are doing, of what the vocals are doing, with a little bit of brightness of what the guitar sound is putting on the table. I like this combination. They didn't just open up the windows and give you all of this brightness at once. They allowed it to linger in, and then the darkness moves back in and the two start to coexist as this song reaches its end. Really interesting track from a soundscape, from a construction perspective. This is it. This is Carcass with Torn Arteries. Let me know your thoughts on the band, on the singles. Use the comment section below. I'll be reading those and getting back to you. Take care, guys.